BGH1 box camera. So the new addition to the Micro Four Thirds platform that we released a little bit, well, earlier this year. Wow, earlier this month, actually. So this camera, this is a really exciting camera for us. For those that are looking at some sort of camera to add into your system, whether you're a broadcaster or even into YouTube. So that's why I've kind of called this one From YouTube to Hollywood. This camera is really designed to fit and allow the area for you to grow into the platform. So one of the first things, before I dive too far into the actual presentation, this entire broadcast is being done on the BGH1 into my software, and we're actually broadcasting this using an anamorphic lens to actually kind of show you guys some of the flexibilities that this has. So with that, I'm actually going to jump over to the presentation now. So like you can see here, we'll just set this up right. All right, so the BGH1 box camera, this is, like we said, our cinema live event style and broadcast camera. So why did we create a camera like this? There's a lot of, kind of talk online about, this maybe not being the camera that everybody had necessarily anticipated Panasonic to release. I know a lot of people have been waiting for an updated GH camera, but there was a lot of study into the market in what both broadcasters and content creators, which is really a term I use, and that's, videographers, cinematographers, have really found new needs in the way business has changed over the last year. And this is actually something that we found was present before the current, kind of global situation we're all in. So looking at a camera need from a reputable manufacturer that allows for live event streaming, that allows for remote control capture, that has professional interfaces, and is designed for even cinematographers and videographers who want something that is easier to use, more flexible as a platform, and doesn't necessarily have to sit in the mirrorless traditional category that we're used to. So when I say mirrorless traditional category, I mean cameras that look like this, that look like interchangeable lens, mirrorless DSLMs, kind of breaking the mold and ironically actually going, thinking inside the box for what it's worth. And a lot of that was by talking with photographers, videographers, cinematographers, and production companies that have uses for cameras to fit in gimbals, drones that are software controlled, for everything from broadcasting like this for YouTube, live event content where you need to send a camera to a client, all the way up to VR style capture and volumetric style recording. So really high-end professional level content creation. So that's where the box camera came from. And what we were able to do with all the technology that we've built is to take a platform that a set of hardware that had relatively been successful in the major motion picture world and find a way to build it into a more compact, more user-friendly platform, even though for a lot of cases, it might not initially come off as a quote-unquote user-friendly camera. So with the box camera, its core kind of concept is that it's compact, lightweight, and can be put anywhere in the most demanding of filming situations. So the addition of things like an Ethernet port. So those that have followed the market and have seen box style cameras, an Ethernet port's not necessarily a new thing. However, this is the first time in a consumer level product, and I use the word consumer for anything outside of a production house, so like the larger big production studios. This is the first time in a LUMIX product and in a traditional reputable brand consumer product that you have the ability to connect into an Ethernet connection and allow control, video signal, and power to be delivered into your camera. There's also a future firmware update coming that's going to support IP video streaming for this. So for those that need to literally just mount a camera into a location, plug in a network cable, and have it immediately send a video feed out that you can tap into with software like OBS or Streamlabs or anything like that, a firmware update is coming to support that on the BGH1 as well. We also took a lot of pride in the fact that we've developed the LUMIX Tether for Multicam software, which I will actually give you guys a live demonstration of in a few minutes. Now, this allows a ton of control for this camera as well as multiple other cameras, as the name kind of indicates, multicam. We've also added a number of professional interfaces to this camera that are, again, a first on a LUMIX product that really are those industry standard connections for the professional market. So SDI, Genlock, timecode, and the ability to send out content simultaneously over HDMI and SDI, while also still being able to send control and video feed over USB or LAN, so that Ethernet connection. This is also one of the fastest focusing and most accurate focusing box style cameras on the market. For a Micro Four Thirds camera, we've updated this system with the same algorithms that we've released in the LUMIX S5 and deployed them into a camera that's using a much faster readout sensor, which is the 10.2 megapixel multi-aspect sensor, which was found in the GH5S prior to this. And since it's using that sensor, we're still able to work with the 13 stops of dynamic range, which is an improvement on the box camera over a GH5S. It still works with the dual native ISO system, which is a manually selectable system, which means we're getting 10-bit Cinema 4K 60p. We have 422 10-bit recording internally as well as output on this camera. And as you can see with my camera, we've got anamorphic support and variable frame rate up to 240 frames per second. So with a lot of those additions, it also means that this camera is designed for easy installation and multiple different power options, which I'll touch on a little bit later. For those that are working with remote controllers for your camera, which for the most part, a lot of us are working with Lank controllers. So for zoom, focus, iris change, things like that, we are also compatible with a number of the Lank controllers out there. Our remote port socket is just called general use in our system. So if you're used to working with a GH5 or a GH5S, you know what that size and that platform and how those cameras feel. Well, in comparison, the BGH1 is smaller in every dimension than the GH5S, and it's also lighter. So it is one of the lightest Micro Four Thirds cameras that we've produced that still carries all of this professional capabilities. So you're 545 grams versus 580. Now, that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but what really steps it up in this category is the fact that when you shift the weight distribution around into an actual cube or a box, working with things like gimbals and drones becomes much, much more easy than it was with traditional DSLM styled cameras. So again, pushing that idea that yes, this is a new form factor, but going back to kind of the basics and providing the highest quality you can with the highest level of reliability from a brand that has been around for over 100 years was one of the core concepts with this. So when you look around the outside of the camera, you'll see that you have tons of 1/4-20 threads mounted all over the sides of this camera. You have 3 on the top, 3 on each side, and 2 on the bottom. So if you're someone who doesn't like to necessarily rig your camera up with a cage for mounting solutions, you have a number of native mounting capabilities with this camera right out of the gate. There are cages available for the camera if you're someone who does like to work with a cage for the added mounting capabilities and security that they can offer. So those are already in production and will pretty much coincide with the release of the camera for shipping. So you have a nice red record button. You have the control wheel, which again is that kind of homage to the GH series cameras. If you're someone coming from that platform, it's the same kind of control dial and menu system. So everything's very easy to transition into. You have your main custom function button up top, which by default is just set to toggle the info display out over HDMI, SDI, or to disable it. Your traditional quick menu button, your image playback, delete, cancel, all those things, all the core button operations are up top. Front of the camera, you have 3 more custom function buttons, which can be, like they're called, customized to pretty much any setting in the camera that you'd want. You have your main power button as well as status indicator. You'll notice on the side that you have a intake. On the side, you have intake and exhaust because this camera is an actively cooled system. And then on the left-hand side is where you'll see the dual SD card memory, as well as that 2.5 millimeter remote port and the barrel-style DC 12-volt power supply connection. On the back of the camera is where all the core content is, right? So you have a 3.5 millimeter microphone input, which supports line-in, phantom power, or standard passive microphones. You have a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack for monitoring audio in the camera, as you normally would. Below that's where the 1 gig Ethernet port is, so it's a gigabit LAN. And then even just below that is where we have the Kensington lock mount on this camera for those that are going to be setting this camera up in remote locations where you might not be able to always be attached to your camera to watch it all day and all night. The right-hand side's where all the professional input and output is. So this is where the 3G SDI connector is. This is where our timecode in and out port are. This is where the Genlock terminal is. This is also where our USB Type-C data and video port are, as well as the HDMI full-size connection out. So normal connectors that you would see down here for standard day-to-day use, more professional high-end connectors up here for the different use cases. You'll notice that this camera does also take different batteries than the traditional GH series batteries that we have utilized for a while. This uses our VBR style batteries, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. The bottom of the camera, you've got 2 more quarter 20 threads, as well as a registration kind of lock port thing for anti-twist, things like that on the different tripod plates that you're going to be working with. Now, the front of the camera, you'll notice that we have the front tally lamp. It is actually placed in a more usable position than what traditional cameras are placing with tally lamps. It's a small little subtle thing. But a lot of cameras, you'll have your tally lamp right on the front face of the camera, which means if you're to the top of the camera or to the side of the camera, you can't see it. This is placed on the chamfered edge so that it's visible from the front, the side, the top. And then you have your rear tally lamp as well for obviously indicating that the camera's recording. So with all of those connections, this platform truly does become a place it anywhere and control it anywhere. Like I said, it's got that 3G SDI, which is a full HD support up to 422 10-bit 1080p in 60 frames. You have HDMI, which supports up to Cinema 4K 60p 422 10-bit. We will have that IP video streaming in a future firmware update that should come pretty soon. And you're still able to record internally to commonly found affordable media. You're not going to be stuck with crazy expensive media like CFast. All of this while having that Ethernet port for PoE plus power delivery and control over a network connection. So you'll be able to connect this camera to any monitor, recorder, switcher, or transmitter you can think of for getting your content out to your client or Video Village or into a recorder. And you'll be able to control this camera from any location, whether you're hardwired into it or on a wireless network that the camera's plugged into with that switcher. Now, I mentioned about multicam flexibility. So for those that are building into or already in a platform where you're working with multiple camera arrays for things like VR filming, multi-camera angle, bullet time type videography, volumetric style videography, or platforms like what the company Driving Plates does, where you're capturing 360-degree video for motion picture playback. For with Driving Plates, what they do is they film all the outer car scenes for most major movies. These are the kinds of cameras that are ideal for those platforms. And the 2 main ports that are used for syncing all of this stuff up so that you have perfectly matched cameras across the board would be Genlock, which is the ideal solution, or timecode. These ports are the industry standardized BNC style connectors. So you know that when you have these cameras locked in and the cable's connected, you're not worrying about potentials of a cable being pulled out of the camera, like HDMI on a professional suit is kind of more susceptible to. Now, all of the connectivity is great, but a lot of it's also to do about image quality. So you could have all the connections in the world, but how's the image quality? Well, the BGH1 has taken a step up from what the Micro Four Thirds GH5S was capable of. That camera was a 12-stop V-Log-L camera. It was able to reproduce 12 stops, and it performed pretty admirably. If you've seen movies like Joker or Creed 2, you've seen footage from the GH5 and the GH5S in major motion picture, and it was perfectly matched in with ARRI and RED and all of those other cameras. The BGH1, with all the information that we've learned over the years with releasing cameras like the S1H, the new S5, and even cameras like the VariCam and the EVA1, we've now learned how to better control and better work with the hardware that we've got in this camera. So we're able to pull one additional stop out of the highlight dynamic range on the BGH1, which is now providing a solid 13 stops of dynamic range for those that are working in V-Log-L on this camera. But we've also learned with the new housing, the new physical design of this camera, and the new cooling layout that we're able to actually capture 420 10-bit up to 60p internally in the camera as well, where the GH5, based on its platform, was capped at 420 8-bit, and you had to record externally for 10-bit Cinema 4K 60p content. So that 13 stops of V-Log-L, the dual native ISO, the 10.2 megapixel the 10.2 megapixel 4/3 multi-aspect sensor, all powered by the Venus engine, are the core components that allow us to do these 10-bit Cinema 4K 60p internal recording, the 422 10-bit all intra capabilities internally, as well as the 10-bit internal and output simultaneous recording, HDR video, variable frame rate up to 240 and 1080, and all of our anamorphic functionality, because it wouldn't be a LUMIX product if we didn't support anamorphic capabilities. So, sorry as I adjust my chair there. So one of the common things that people ask us about with the LUMIX products is, well, it's a LUMIX, it's a GH series product. Why doesn't it have quote unquote full V-Log? And the answer is quite simple. It does have full V-Log. The difference here is that V-Log is just a term. V-Log-L with the BGH1, with the GH5, the G9, and the GH5S is a tailored version of V-Log to support the maximum amount of dynamic range that the given sensor is able to produce. If that sensor cannot produce 14 stops of dynamic range or greater, it's classified as V-Log-L. If it can produce 14 stops or greater, like the S1, S1, S1H, and S1, and all the VariCam products, then it gets the V-Log color profile for naming. So with this camera, we're closer to that full, quote unquote, full V-Log, but we're still at 13 stops. So we're still slightly below that 14 stop threshold that's required for us to name it V-Log. But we've been able to get that dynamic range in the areas where most people have wanted to see better dynamic range, and that is in the highlights. So we're 5 stops over your midtone mark. We're 8 stops under your midtone mark with the BGH1, where the GH5 and the GH5S were only 4 stops over. So your highlight roll-off is going to look better. Your highlight detail is better because you've got another stop of dynamic range there. And just like the previous cameras, you still have the ability to load in your own LUTs to actually monitor the V-Log footage instead of monitoring, the gray flat V-Log profile. So the next part about this was that dual native ISO capabilities. So with dual native ISO in a camera like this, which is how we operate it different than most other companies who have what's called a dual gain system, is our camera allows you to manually select which ISO circuit you want to use. So if you're filming out in broad daylight, like I do a lot of times with this camera, I can just select low range, set it to 400 when I'm shooting in Vlog L, and I know I'm maximizing and I'm taking the best advantage of that 13 stops of dynamic range. If I'm filming in a situation like this, where I'm in my home studio, I'm working on broadcasting content for my weekly live stream, or I'm teaching classes, I can flip it into that high circuit, set it to 2000 ISO, or set it to somewhere in that range, and adjust my lighting accordingly so I can keep a solidly looking piece of content to deliver out online. Now, a little tip that a lot of people don't necessarily know of when it comes to working with a dual gain system or a dual native ISO circuitry system is that if you're setting your camera up for YouTube, like what I'm like doing now, if I'm doing all my metering and it's telling me to set my ISO at say 1600, because that's where I get the best balance, I have the right look for my shadows, my highlights, don't set your camera in auto ISO and then just run your ISO up to 1600. And this is the same for any of our cameras that have this mode. Set it into the 2000 ISO for the high range, and then enable extended ISO and pull down to 1600. You'll get a much cleaner looking piece of footage. You'll give up a little bit of highlight dynamic range because you're pulling the exposure down like we used to do with film, but you'll get a much cleaner looking piece of footage than just shooting 1600 ISO with most traditional sensors. So the low light functionality of this is way above what even most of the other cameras are out there. So that kind of coverage again there, 13 stops of dynamic range, cinema 4K up to 60p, 4K up to 60p as well. Variable frame rate up to 240 and 60 frames in cinema 4K, and Vlog L is pre-installed in this camera. So there's nothing additional you need to get to be able to take advantage of all the features that this camera has. Now, I mentioned, with the class title here that this is from YouTube to Hollywood. Now, for those of us that are spending more time behind, the computer, reaching out and working with clients, with customers that are podcasting, that are, vlogging, that are holding, a weekly video podcast, having control over your camera when you might not necessarily be able to constantly be able to reach up and work with it is an important thing. And it's something that you don't realize is a frustration until you've worked with something that eases that stress for your day-to-day work. The addition of the Ethernet connectivity on this camera means that I can now have multi-camera setups for my YouTube presentations where I have my main camera here, I have a second camera next to it, I could have a camera mounted on the ceiling for a downward shot, all connected with just Ethernet cables into a network switch that then is master controlled on my desktop. So I never have to go reach to work with one of my cameras. I don't have to kind of figure out where my focus is if I'm using AF lenses. I can control all of that from the LUMIX Tether for Multicam software now. But in addition to that, it also means that if my switcher is PoE plus spec'd, I can run power to all of those cameras as well. So I'm not worrying about changing batteries. I'm not worrying about running extension cables for a DC power adapter for this. I don't have to worry about any kind of powering solution for these. And it's not some, kind of piece together solution to enable me to run a camera for like long periods at a time. Now, for the higher end productions, this also serves a lot of support for them as well. With the PoE Plus and the Ethernet connection, I could have multiple cameras set up in a production studio, all being controlled by a main kind of control center, where our LUMIX Tether for multicam software can natively support up to 12 cameras. But Panasonic LUMIX as the company has also released a public SDK for those that are looking to find ways to create their own control software for this camera, as well as the S1, S1R, S1H, and S5, and even the GH5S, GH5, and G9. So this whole platform has set a new standard for the way we move forward with a lot of our cameras. allowing customers to be able to write their own write their own control software for Mac, PC, whichever platform you're working on with the publicly provided SDK has been one of the core pushes with this. Now, that IP video streaming, if anybody's worked with IP security cameras, you're probably familiar with how easy it is to set up an IP camera. The LUMIX BGH1 is going to be the same exact setup. The camera will feed out an IP address that you can then access on your network, or if you're VPN'd into your home network or a remote location, you can then just load that IP address into a software for that camera's video feed to pipe into, and you'll be able to monitor, record, and broadcast that content as well. So that becomes truly a one cable connection for on-site video recording and capture. Now, we don't have specs yet on the frame rate and resolutions, but we will have more of that as we get closer to when that firmware actually releases. So now I'm going to take a second away here and actually jump away from the broadcast, and I'm going to spotlight my video feed here. So everyone should be seeing my camera as the full feed. So when I talk about that multicam software, this is the interface for LUMIX Tether for multicam. I have all of my camera controls, so I can change the actual recording modes for resolution and frame rates. I can change this legitimately into an anamorphic 4:3 capture because I'm shooting with anamorphic. I can take full advantage of all of the lovely flares that you get with anamorphic for those that are really looking after for this stuff. And I also have the ability to click on the camera icon here and pull up any camera that's attached over Ethernet onto this network, and also even USB. If you've got enough cameras plugged in on USB, you can also control it this way. Now, when I've got one camera plugged in and I'm controlling one individual camera, you'll see that you have a menu option up here. Now, a lot of you may have noticed that this camera does not have a physical LCD or viewfinder on it. So the question then is, well, how do you control the menu on this? So if you're connected into a network like I am here, I can click menu and then now have full access to the entire camera menu as if I was working on an actual touchscreen for this. So like what I'm doing here, where I have my camera actually sending out the video feed de-squeezed into a recorder, I can come in and change the level of that de-squeeze. I can turn it off if I want to. I can set all of my different kind of recording options right here in this menu. The other cool thing is, for those that work in a remote location, if you are trying to get all your camera angles to be properly color balanced, I can have something that's got, kind of white. This isn't the proper way to do it, but I can click white set, just click on that one icon, and then do a quick white balance for those individual cameras. So you're not bound by whatever the one camera was set up as. When you click on camera again, if you have multiple cameras set up here, this is where you can select all cameras, and you can universally change all of these settings across every single camera, and they'll all be synced to the same exact settings. So this is where, if I have a multi-camera setup for my own YouTube studio, I'd have one camera there, one camera off to the side, one camera up top. I can control every single one of them from right here at my desk without having to get up and move. And the cooler part is I can also trigger recording of each of those cameras, or I can trigger recording on all of those cameras. So I don't have to, determine, do I want this camera recording? Do I have to get up and go change that? Once you've done recording the cameras internally, you also have the ability to send that footage over to your computer over Ethernet. So you have the quickest way from content gathering on the camera to storage on the device that you're capturing with. And you can change all of that just by clicking in here. Whether you want to store locally on the memory card plus the computer, or just come in and say, I just want to have it send just into the computer that I'm working with. Now, if you're working where you've got a couple cameras set up, and say I have that camera on the ceiling that's pointing down on my studio, and I don't want to take it down to do, say, a firmware update because we push a new update with it, all you have to do is click Setting, select the camera that you're working on, and then just do firmware update. This is where you can just add the firmware file in and it'll push it over Ethernet to the camera or over USB to the camera you're working with. So this software really becomes crazy powerful for the multiple different ways that you could be using this in different platforms. So the cool thing too here is, as you can see, I just went to my HDMI feed out. So I'm going to cover this a little bit more with, actually, I'll wait to do that. I'll do it this way, and you guys can look at the 16:9 aspect ratio D-squeeze that I've got here. So if I jump back in and pull up my PowerPoint here.
Hey, Sean, before you do that.
Yes.
We've got a killer question that I want to cover while you were on the multicam software.
Shoot.
And I need some help answering this one, so I'm going to go to you, buddy.
That's why I'm here.
So Anthony's asking this.
Mm-hmm.
With tethering software, can it work in multicam configuration with varying connection, i.e. S1H using HDMI? Now, of course, we understand you can't control it via HDMI, but here's my question for you that I'm not sure of. So if I've got 3 BGH1s and I have 3 S1Hs, can I record or can I control all 6 via the multicam software, or only the BGH1s via Ethernet?
So currently, the LUMIX Tether for multicam software is only compatible for multicam control with the BGH1.
Correct. That's what I thought.
That is one of the reasons why we released the SDK, because we do have a number of clients that are deploying S1 series cameras where they want more control. So they can develop their own software because they have all of the control information required to build a software to control all of these things. And I do know that there are a couple companies that are developing their own control pieces of software. I don't know if those are for public or if those are for specific jobs, but it is something that's possible with someone who knows how to write code. By default, the system only supports the BGH1 for now because it has additional functionality over a lot of the other cameras. And it does, since it doesn't have an actual monitor, having a control software like this is one of those things that's kind of like required for this kind of camera operation.
Exactly.
So I hope that helped.
Yeah, you covered it. I basically suggested that if you had multiple BGH1s, you could do that through the multicam software. And you could run a separate laptop for a single S1H or even a sync application for that.
Yes.
And that would be able to allow you to control all that. All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So, yeah. So like I said, that's the multicam software control. You also have the ability to sync all your camera settings. So if you've got one camera and you want to push all of your setup to another camera that's on the network, you can do that for every camera attached as well. Now, if you're not working with a computer and you just need to control one of your cameras, you do still have the full functionality that the LUMIX series has had with Wi-Fi. So that means that we have our LUMIX Sync app, which will give you full camera control minus the actual camera menu for things like white balance, ISO, shutter speed, shutter angle, whatever recording mode you want to select in, all controlled with a mobile device. So the way I work with this camera when I'm not sitting here using it as a production camera, if I have this mounted on my motorcycle, I will have the app running on my phone with Wi-Fi feeding out from the camera, setting everything up, clicking record with it, and then I can close the app and I know that the camera's set up, recording how I want it to record to the SD cards. It truly allows for full functionality, whether you're linked into a system or you're out remotely in a single camera operation. Now, like I said, we've included a number of video outputs on this camera, and there is the HDMI port, which most of us are probably incredibly familiar with. It is kind of the industry standard for, everyday camera connectivity. You're able to support 4K 60p 422 10-bit recording to an external recorder like an Atomos Ninja 5 or something of that nature. But it has some downsides. Even a full-size HDMI cable is not one of the most secure connections to put into a camera. There's no locking mechanism to keep that cable attached. Another potential downside is that it's much shorter for cable runs. You're maxing up somewhere around 10 meters for an HDMI cable. So if you need to mount this camera and run a feed out that way, you're not running it much longer than 10 meters. Now, a lot of people may be thinking 10 meters, that's long enough for most cases. But if you're on a production studio, it's not. So the HDMI port becomes that ideal solution for things like an external recorder. Again, like the Atomos Ninja 5 that I use often with these devices. That's a close proximity monitor. It allows you to record ProRes into the monitor if you want to be able to do, a little bit easier to edit with your footage. You don't have to worry about the unlimited recording time because the camera already does unlimited recording time. But it just offers you that additional benefit. Now, we included an SDI connection on this camera, and it's a 3G SDI. Now, a lot of people have been asking, why is it a 3G SDI? Why not 6G or 12G? And the reason behind this is that the SDI terminal on this camera was designed specifically for the broadcast needs for now and in the future. Most broadcasting is actually the vast majority of broadcasting is done in 1080p still. Most network switchers for major broadcasters don't support 6G because it's not really a fully publicized standard yet, and nobody's using 12G for that. So the 3G SDI means that it fits and plugs right into current broadcast and realistically the current near future broadcast functionality that's required. So that means that it supports 60p, full HD, 422 10-bit. Now, the benefits for that is that obviously it's a BNC style connection. So it's nice and sturdy. You're not going to pull a cable out for any reason. I mean, you'd rip the cable out of the connector before you'd pull it out of the camera. The other big advantage is that it can run up to around 100 meters. So much longer cable runs and more secure. So what does this mean for average everyday users, right? So if I'm using this camera and I want to be doing focus pulling while I'm recording and sending content for, say, I'm working with manual lenses like this anamorphic lens, or I've got a follow focus on it, SDI has much less latency than HDMI does. So if you're someone who needs a monitor for focus pulling with this and you're recording internally with, say, the all-intra codecs, get an SDI monitor for this. If you're someone who wants to record out with HDMI and you want to have the highest quality possible with it, then plug it in with HDMI and use a recorder there. So the cool thing with this is that you can do both of these outputs simultaneously, even while you're recording internally onto the SD card. So you're not limited by any one choice over the other. You can use all of them together at the same time, like I am, because I have, for this de-squeezed content, it's out to a Shogun Inferno via SDI. The Shogun Inferno is HDMI out into my ATEM Mini. The ATEM Mini has the channel selected for the SDI feed. If I select the other feed, that's the HDMI feed. And I have the control and video feed going over my Ethernet cable over onto my computer. So we mentioned Genlock before. Now, this is the first on a LUMIX and arguably one of the cheapest, least expensive cameras on the market that supports Genlock in. So for those that don't know what Genlock is, this is a frame-perfect synchronization that's possible on multiple BGH1s when using a Genlock controller. This differs from those of us that may be used to working with timecode, where timecode can drift. Timecode is not frame-perfect synchronization. So when you start frame one and you're syncing everything through, they can all be slightly off from each other, but they're all still within the first frame. So the accuracy is close enough, but because of that slight distance between being perfectly frame synced together, you can run into issues where audio starts to lag out or cameras start to desync over longer periods of recording time. And I know, watching online and following a number of users online, I have seen and heard a number of people having issues with timecode syncing in current everyday cameras. With Genlock and a Genlock controller, I can have multiple cameras all connected together, and trigger every single camera so that they are frame perfect across the board. So I can have as many cameras as I can connect in with my Genlock controller and have them perfectly sync. This is what's required for things like VR recording, bullet time, or even stuff where company, I think it's called 4D replay, where if major sporting events like basketball, football, things like that, if you've seen the content where the players, basketball players running down the court, goes up to make a dunk, and then in the playback, you're seeing the camera feed swing around the player and you're watching them move through midair. That's done with cameras that ideally would be Genlocked together. Right now, one of the companies that I know is using LUMIX cameras has been doing this with GH cameras and has made their own solution to make it work. But BGH1 is the ideal solution in those platforms because of Genlock. Now, it wouldn't be a LUMIX product if we didn't stand on our reputation for reliability. Now, with all of our cameras, that also comes down to thermal management and the claims when we state that a camera can record unlimited, that we are designing and building a product to meet those actual statements. So with the BGH1, we're able to have heat simulations done before the cameras are even produced to determine what kind of materials we need to build these cameras out of. With the BGH1, it meant that we wanted to now mix aluminum and magnesium alloy into the chassis because of their different heat dissipation properties. Then to go one step further, we added in the cooling fan from the S1H, which is a near silent running fan anyway, and allow us for true unlimited recording up to a rated 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the average temperature that all of our competitors test to is only around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So we are miles above what everyone else is holding as their standard, because a product that says that it can record unlimited or record to a time limit, if there is a time limit, has to be able to do it, and it has to be able to do it reliably. You can't run into a situation where the camera stops because it's thermaled and then you have to wait 20 minutes to an hour to be able to record again with it. So as I mentioned before, the camera also supports autofocus. In a Micro Four Thirds camera and in a box type camera, it is the fastest, most accurate focusing camera. Aside from the Komodo, I have not tested that or seen any good results out of that yet, because I think people that I've watched have been using beta stuff on it. So outside of the red Komodo, because I don't have information on that, it is one of the fastest focusing, most accurate AF systems on the market. This uses the algorithms that we've developed from the S5, but applies them to a sensor that reads out infinitely faster, as well as is also a lower resolution, so the pixel readout, again, is also much faster. So with this, you're going to see marked improvements in focus recognition, focus tracking, as well as the size that an object has to be in the frame for it to be recognized and to focus with it. We've also added the head detection in this camera, so you have the ability to use face and eye detection even if the face is not facing towards the camera, to detect the irises in the visible spots there. Now, like I said, the camera has dual SD cards, so you have the ability to do relay recording, backup recording, and allocation recording with this camera. So for those that are going to be doing long-term, long-form recording, whether you're on YouTube and you're going to be filming an entire day's worth of streaming and you want to have a hard backup instead of just what your YouTube feed would be, you're able to hot swap memory cards on this camera. If you're a production studio or you're a filmer, a filmmaker that's recording a wedding, say, you'll be able to have this camera just continually record as long as you can feed it cards using relay. Now, if you're someone who is paranoid like I am and you need the ability to have an immediate backup of all of your recording, you have backup recording, which is also supported for the 400 megabit all intra codecs that we record on this camera. Now, you do need to use V90 cards for that functionality, but it's recommended to use V90 cards across the board anyway, even in most other cameras, not even just ours. It's probably a good idea to buy faster, higher end cards nowadays anyway. And for those that need to be able to capture stills with this camera, you can also do allocation recording on this by using the LUMIX Tether for Multicam software, which is the only way you can capture stills with it as well. So for production stills, you can quickly snap a still for production use and share it out that way. It is a JPEG only, and it's 10.2 megapixels, and you'll be in the 4:3 aspect ratio. So looking at all of these different recording modes that are capable on the camera, the vast majority of these are the same that are found on the GH5S. But anything that's highlighted here is the new addition that is exclusive to the BGH1. So those are 420 10-bit long-op HEVC compression at 200 megabits for up to 60p in Cinema 4K internally. And you have that ability up to 50p if you're recording anamorphic. And you also have the MP4 variant for 420 10-bit HEVC up to 60p as well. Now, again, if you notice, all of this is unlimited recording. The carryover from the GH5S is the 422 10-bit all intro recording. So for those filming fast motion and heavy action, you have an all intro codec. It's 400 megabits. It's a tried and true codec with the LUMIX products, and it makes its return here. That is supported up to 30p in 4K and anamorphic and 60p in 1080 internally. Anything higher than this is where you need to start looking at an external HDMI recorder to get higher quality output using something like ProRes. Now, we also have that variable frame rate. So we've got up to 240 frames per second slow motion, which is a pre-slowed down piece of footage. So it already comes out slow motion. Or you can do up to 30 times real speed for quick direct video time-lapse or hyperlapse functionality. Now, as I mentioned, we have anamorphic function with this camera, as you've been seeing my camera feed the entire time. So anamorphic recording in this camera is a true 4:3 aspect ratio capable anamorphic function, which if I change my camera over to actually anamorphic, you'll see that in this case, I'm filling the frame in 16:9 with my de-squeezed footage here. So my face looks like the way it should. This lens doesn't have all of the characteristics of your typical anamorphic lens. It's not as cat's-eyed with the bokeh back here, but you get that flare. You get that kind of J.J. Abrams look out of it, and it's a solid performing option for those that want to step up your capture. Now, with the camera, we provide all of the tools that you need for anamorphic work, which means we provide anamorphic de-squeeze in the camera. For monitoring, so you have 130 all the way up to 2x anamorphic de-squeeze, and you can send that de-squeezed image out over SDI, USB, or Ethernet. HDMI, because of the way HDMI is spec'd, does not support de-squeezed content. When you record with this camera, you'll get an image that looks like this. You're going to have a squeezed piece of footage, which is crushing down, and you're getting the black bars on the side because it has to fit within a 16:9 aspect ratio within the HDMI standard. So the inclusion of the SDI means I can actually use this to send out anamorphic, or I can use this over USB or Ethernet to actually use it out or as a webcam with anamorphic, for those that want to do anamorphic YouTube. The camera is also fully compatible with the XLR1 audio adapter. So that's allowing you to do high resolution audio. It's powered through the hot shoe on this camera, and it sends and injects the audio signal from the hot shoe down into the footage. So it's truly a plug and play device. You get dual full size XLR connectors. You have all of the AD conversion is done up in this device. So it's a much better preamp than what you would have with a standard 3.5 millimeter input on the camera. But you have the flexibility for one or the other. Now, I mentioned about batteries on this camera. So the camera comes out of the box with the AC adapter, and you also have the flexibility to power this camera out of the box with a PoE Plus switcher. PoE Plus is the standard that you just have to make sure that that switcher or network switch is capable of. Again, just make sure that it's got the plus there. There is a PoE as well, but that does not deliver enough power to actually run the device. So you need PoE plus. When it comes to batteries, as is common with box style cameras, batteries are available for this. We make 4 separate ones for this under the Panasonic branding: a 58, a 59, an 89G, and a 118G. The 118G is capable of recording up to about 8 hours of recording. Something that is in the 8,900 milliamp hours. So the 89G is going to get you around 5.5 hours of recording, of continuous recording, all on one battery. These are the same style batteries that we use for cameras like the DVX, the X2000, the X1500. It's a similar camcorder styled battery. So there are additional chargers available for it, and there's plenty of options out there to power supply this camera over battery options. So that quick kind of rundown here: dual native ISO, Vlog-L 13 stops, you have SDI, you have a slight bump up in VFR functions for anamorphic shooting. You'll have, if you're someone coming from a GH5 or a GH5S, you'll notice that the Cine-like color profiles are different in this camera. It matches closer to the S1H because it uses the Cine D2 and Cine V2 profile. And because of the increased dynamic range with Vlog-L, the camera is going to match closer to an S1H and a Vericam than necessarily the current LUTs and workflow that you may be working with on a GH5S. It's a quick and easy way to upgrade into the workflow with a BGH1, but know that there is a slight difference because the camera has that additional stop of dynamic range. So again, you have the tally lamps, gen lock in, time code in and out. You have that 2.5 millimeter remote socket, which is what we're just calling general use. It's, in all reality, it's pretty much a LANC connector. We just don't call it LANC. So if you look at devices that are LANC compatible, 90% of them are compatible with this system as well. You have SDI, full-size Type A HDMI, USB 3.1 Type C, dual SD cards, your standard 3.5 millimeter inputs, as well as that Ethernet compatibility for IP streaming and 12 camera control. So when you look at like the different uses where we see this camera fitting and where it's already being deployed, anyone who's out there filming and you can't have a large crew anymore, you've got the ability to have multiple cameras deployed and controlled from one location now. So something where you've got a camera on a slider, you're using a target module like what this one is from Edelkron. You're able to control the camera, send the video feed out, and trigger lock and gen lock for all of these cameras. When you look at streaming content, if you're a single person operation and you need to be able to broadcast a ton of different angles, whether you're a YouTuber like this, or you're even, say, like a house of worship or a convention hall, you're able to have multiple cameras set out and controlled in a singular location with wireless mic capabilities, or with even XLR audio plugged right into a board, taking the master audio into your cameras. Then the cinema users. Because it's micro four thirds, it's one of the most adaptable mounts on the market. So you're able to put PL lenses on this. It's flexible and perfectly suited to mount on handheld gimbals, to work on a pair of sticks, or even function handheld for cinema recording, or even drone and broadcast functionality. So with drones, the cool thing is you don't necessarily need something like this M600 Pro drone. During the launch of this, we had it mounted to 5-inch race and aerobatic drones, and we're able to record some amazing footage that way. So if you take a look at the launch video that we did with this, you'll see footage that was done with an aerobatic drone and the BGH1 mounted to it. And then documentary filmmakers or news gathering, things like that. You've got a discrete camera that is still fully capable of recording all of the high-end content that you would need, as well as all of the connections that you need for XLR, for your XLR audio, and the multiple different ways that you're going to hand hold it. So whether with mounting solutions like some of these cages, or mounted on sticks for audio recording and news coverage. So That's the presentation. I want to make sure that there's time so that everyone, if you have questions, that you can either come off mute if you want to, or you can use the chat, and we can kind of just do Q&A, and I can cover anything that I may have not covered in depth for you guys. Oh, and this is my email address, so you can feel free to reach out if you have questions that come up later on as well. So let me stop sharing this presentation and remove the spotlight. And I'll pull up the chat. Let's see, what kinds of questions did we have, if we had any?
We pretty much covered it with the one I brought up to you. So if there's any other questions out there, unmute yourself or drop them in the chat, and Sean will be more than happy to answer them.
I like Matthew's comment. Sean sounds like Edward Snowden right now. I don't know what I said that I sound like Edward Snowden.
Just informative enough, and I was just feeling like I was being pretty educated. So I was like, yep, that's what it was.
Awesome, cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Hey, Sean, on the this is Anthony.
Yeah.
On the Genlock, you know, I know in terms of like some of the, you know, kind of, I've worked on stuff that, you know, where we've used video trucks, but, you know, kind of that stuff, fortunately or unfortunately, it's kind of like, that ends up being engineers that work on that stuff, and and I'm a producer, so it's like hands off, don't touch that shit.
Yep.
And get the hell out. So but when I'm working on, you know, kind of the streaming stuff, it's much more DIY. So in terms of the Genlock stuff, I know it's extremely important, or I feel at least it's extremely important. Do you have recommendations in terms of like, or configurations of, is it you need it per camera, or is it you need it one, like, do you need it like one audio recorder, or what exactly, what things do you need for the setup?
So for things like Genlock, you basically would be setting up with your control device, and you could just tentacle sync out into all of your cameras. If you're not doing anything that is critical for frame perfect sync, it's kind of overkill for Genlock for something like that. Like if I'm doing something like this on, say, YouTube, or even a more simplified broadcast like what I do weekly for Panasonic Lumix, that's actually something that's easy to just control either with an HDMI mini switcher. So like I use an ATEM mini when I'm having multiple camera angles, because it allows me to feed it out. If you need a Genlock controller, that's where you could use something like, I know Blackmagic makes the mini converters. They make the sync generators. Yeah, so there's a bunch of different controllers that are available for it if you need it, but you would have to have all the cameras connected all at the same time.
Okay. So that's really, so basically if it's, so the tentacle, you know, if you use that tentacle stuff, but you just need to make sure that basically it's all or nothing.
Yeah. Because when you're working that way, every camera always has to be connected to it. So you need to have everything constantly connected. For DIY solutions, it's kind of overkill. I wouldn't advise going down that road yet. But they're also not that, I mean, they can be really expensive, Genlock or sync generators, but they're not always necessary, kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And in terms of like with the cable runs, I know, I know basically it it opens up kind of being able to put a camera on having a camera on kind of in a much more remote position as opposed to with an HDMI feed. Both with the Ethernet connection or the BNC. So in terms of that, is there something though, and this is where, random, with that the Blackmagic Mini, if you're connecting, the 4 cameras with HDMI, I know it's got an Ethernet port. Does it support IP?
The ATEM?
Yeah.
I don't think the ATEM Mini does. You'd have to actually look. I think is it the ATEM Mini ISO or the Pro? I think you can do. You can send an RTMP link out of it,
okay,
or you can have it send to an RTMP.
Uh-huh.
As kind of like a stopgap for multi-camera capabilities, because then it's one device for it.
Uh-huh.
What will kind of be a little bit easier down the line is when we have that firmware update that comes out that supports IP camera natively in the cameras.
Uh-huh.
I could have 4 cameras just plugged into my switch, and I could have OBS open and have 4 separate camera feeds coming in without the need of an actual like physical switcher or any hardware. You just have the cameras plugged in. And that would give you a virtual switch capability.
Explain that to me.
So with the firmware update, the camera is going to allow you to plug an Ethernet cable into the camera and have it plugged into a switch and generate an IP video feed right from the camera.
Right, but I'm plugging that into a switch into what type of switch?
Just a network switcher. So something like a Logitech, or not Logitech, Linksys, just gigabit network switch on a wired network.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it basically means that you could have, and actually something that myself and one of my coworkers here have been toying around with is, with that IP capabilities, that means if you're someone who's doing, say, these kind of extravagant multi-camera feeds where you need to be able to record, say 20 different camera feeds, you could have all 20 cameras plugged in over Ethernet into a switch, run into a closed network or an open network, doesn't matter, and have a program like, and I use OBS because it's the most common one to reference with this.
Right.
I could be using OBS and literally have a 20 camera feed in a single feed, because I can just take all 20 camera IP feeds as sources into my scene. That also means that if I'm a video production crew, I could be having all of these different camera feeds plugging into their own recording capabilities, and not have to run SDI cables, not have to run power. I could just be running Cat6e all over the place, which is a heck of a lot easier to work with, and be even remote controlling all of those cameras as well. So I don't have to go to every location and control them.
And what control surface am I using? So I know those. Okay, so I understand the switcher, and then what control surface then am I using? Anything that?
So for that is where you'd be able to control those cameras here in the tether software that we have.
Okay.
Or if you're going over 12 cameras, I mean, 20 cameras is a crazy number for a lot of this stuff. But if I'm doing 12 cameras or under, I can do it all here. So when I click camera, every camera's there.
But I'm controlling that, and I'm setting them up and whatnot. But how am I switching them?
So for something like that, that's where I would be using like OBS or any other kind of program that's taking
okay. So I'm just
the IP feed.
Okay, so then I'm just switching. Then I'm switching on OBS, and I'm switching. So I'm setting up scenes on OBS, and then I'm switching scenes.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So it really, it's truly the way it's designed. It's however you can really kind of imagine you want to have the setup work.
Yep.
It'll pretty much do it, especially once that firmware comes out.
Cool.
Yeah, it's pretty
so
crazy flexible.
So basically, I can have OBS. I can have that. I can have OBS. I can set up those scenes, and I could even. And then in that case, I can have whatever. I can have an Elgato configuration controlling, like being my control surface for what I've for control my control surface for OBS.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like that's how I do it. I have one of the Stream Decks that I use for changing scenes and all that kind of stuff when I'm doing my broadcasts.
Cool.
So you can program that, and if you have the big one, you could have every single individual camera angle just clicking through it, and you've got probably the most flexible switcher you can think of for IP streaming.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. And when is that? Sorry, when is that update? When are you looking at that coming out?
We haven't released when that update's coming. I'm hoping it's coming relatively soon. I don't think it's coming by the end of the year, though. I think by the end of the calendar year.
Yeah.
Because I know we have a big firmware release coming on Monday, which we've already announced. But that's for the S series and the G100. This one, usually it's a couple of months after a camera launches that we do a substantial update to it with firmware.
Nice. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Not a problem. Any other questions, anybody? I know we're running a bit longer than what the thing was scheduled for, so no one will offend me if you've got to jump off.
Well, we want to thank you for your excellent presentation, Sean. This has been very educational for me, and I work for Panasonic. And I'm very, very excited about this camera.
Yeah, me too.
John, I had a quick question.
Yeah. Someone had a question, I think. I think whoever had a question, I think the camera froze or we lost audio. Yep. Well, anyway, I'm going to throw my email address down here in the chat again. So if anybody has further questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, yeah, I want to thank everybody for taking the time. And yeah, hope you guys all have a good rest of your night.
And have
Thank
a
you,
good
Sean.
weekend, everybody.
Thanks everyone for attending. Have a good evening.
See you later, everybody.